In the spring of 1869, in the windswept plains of Kansas, where the prairie grass stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to mock human ambition, Margery Falls gave birth to a daughter who would die within hours of drawing her first breath. 10 days later, in the same bedroom of the same farmhouse, she would give birth again to what appeared to be the exact same child, with identical features, identical cries, and an identical birthmark that would convince everyone present that they were witnessing something that defied every law of nature and medicine. This is the story of a grief so deep it may have opened a tear in reality itself, one wide enough for a soul to slip back into a world it had barely entered before being taken away. It is a story that shook the frontier's understanding of life and death, and of the unseen bond between a mother and her child. What unfolded inside a remote Kansas farmhouse over 10 days in April 1869 became the kind of tale whispered for generations. The legend spread far beyond the prairie, carried by those who had heard it secondhand and those who claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. Some believed it a miracle, others thought it a curse, and there were those who dismissed it entirely, seeing only the desperate imaginings of a mother unable to face the loss of her child. But for the few who were present, the events defied science and left even the most devout searching for answers. Before we step fully into this account, one that presses against the limits of what we believe possible, you should know what you're in for. This space is dedicated to stories that challenge the lines we draw between the living and the dead, between what we accept as real and what we insist cannot be. If you're ready to examine mysteries that test the very foundations of what we think life means, make sure you're following along and share in the comments where you're listening from. You may find that what happened to Margery Falls speaks to truths far closer to home than you expect. But to understand this strange chapter, we have to begin not with the birth itself, but with the world that shaped Margery Falls and the loss that would mark her life forever. In 1869, Millerville, Kansas was hardly a town at all, more a scattering of ambition and resilience spread across the prairie like seeds carried by the wind. Around 30 families called it home, drawn west by the promise of free land and the hope of building something lasting out of sheer will and backbreaking labor. Most were farmers, though some raised cattle or tried their fortunes in other trades, anything that might help them endure winters that could kill and droughts that could erase years of effort in a single season. The Kansas Territory had only achieved statehood 8 years earlier, and communities like Millerville existed in a state of constant uncertainty about their survival. Indian raids were still a real threat. Locusts could devour entire crops in a single day, and diseases could sweep through isolated settlements with devastating speed. Every family understood that they were gambling their lives on the hope that the land would provide enough to sustain them and their children. Robert Falls had brought his young wife Margery to Kansas in 1867, purchasing 160 acres of prairie land under the Homestead Act and building a small farmhouse from sod and timber he hauled from a grove of cottonwood trees along a distant creek. Robert was 28 years old, a veteran of the Civil War who had seen enough of civilization's cruelties to believe that the frontier offered the best chance for building a life based on honest work and simple values. Margery was 22 when they arrived in Kansas, the daughter of a Methodist minister from Ohio, who had raised her to believe in hard work, divine providence, and the importance of community bonds in times of trouble. She was a small woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, but she possessed the kind of inner strength that frontier life demanded from anyone who hoped to survive its challenges. The Falls farmhouse sat on a slight rise that provided a view across miles of prairie in every direction, making it possible to spot approaching storms, visitors, or threats while they were still hours away. The isolation was both protection and burden, offering safety from some dangers while creating others that came from being too far from neighbors when help was needed. Margery had suffered 2 miscarriages during their first year in Kansas, losses that had devastated her emotionally and left her fearful that she might never successfully carry a child to term. The harsh conditions of frontier life, combined with the limited medical care available in isolated communities, made pregnancy and childbirth dangerous undertakings that claimed the lives of many women and children. Dr. Samuel Morrison, who served the scattered settlements throughout the region, visited families on a rotating schedule that brought him to each community once every few months. Between his visits, residents relied on traditional remedies, midwives with varying levels of experience, and the hope that serious medical emergencies would not occur when professional help was days away. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, the community's most experienced midwife, had attended dozens of births during her 20 years on the frontier. She possessed practical knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned to handle childbirth complications without access to hospitals or trained physicians. But even Mrs. Walsh had never encountered anything like what would happen in the Falls farmhouse during that April of 1869. Margery's 3rd pregnancy had progressed normally through the winter months, giving her reason to hope that this child would survive where the others had not. She felt strong and healthy, the baby moved regularly, and Dr. Morrison's examination during his February visit had suggested that everything was developing as it should. The labor began on April 15th, 1869, during a spring storm that brought heavy rain and wind that rattled the windows of the farmhouse. Mrs. Walsh arrived at dawn, summoned by Robert, who had ridden through the storm to fetch her when Margery's contractions began in earnest during the night. The birth proceeded normally for the first several hours, with contractions that were strong and regular, and a baby that seemed to be positioned correctly for delivery. Mrs. Walsh monitored Margery's condition throughout the morning and noted nothing unusual about the progression of labor. Annabelle Falls was born at 2:17 p.m. on April 15, 1869, arriving easily after a final hour of intense but manageable labor. She was a perfectly formed baby girl, weighing approximately 6 pounds, with dark hair, pale blue eyes, and skin that was pink and healthy. Mrs. Walsh cleaned the infant and wrapped her in blankets that Margery had prepared during the long winter months, then placed the baby in her mother's arms. The moment was one of pure joy for Margery, who had waited through 2 heartbreaking losses to hold a living child. Annabelle cried vigorously, moved her arms and legs normally, and began nursing immediately when offered her mother's breast. Every indication suggested that this was a healthy baby who would thrive under her parents' care. Mrs. Walsh completed the medical procedures that followed childbirth, ensuring that Margery was healing properly and that no complications were developing that might threaten either mother or child. Both appeared to be in excellent condition, leading everyone present to believe that the difficult period of pregnancy and delivery had ended successfully. Robert Falls held his daughter for the first time 30 minutes after her birth, marveling at her tiny fingers and the way she seemed to focus on his face with unusual awareness for such a young infant. He spoke softly to her, welcoming her to the world and promising that he would protect her and provide for her to the best of his ability. "She's perfect," Robert said to Margery as he returned the baby to her arms. "She's got your eyes and your stubborn chin. I think she's going to be just fine." Margery smiled as she looked down at her daughter, feeling a love so intense that it seemed to fill every part of her being. After 2 losses and months of worry, she finally had the child she had dreamed of throughout the long Kansas winter. Annabelle seemed to return her gaze with intelligence that was remarkable for a newborn, as if she understood that she was safe and loved. The tragedy occurred without warning at 4:45 p.m., less than 3 hours after Annabelle's birth. Margery had been resting comfortably, holding the baby and attempting to nurse her again, when she suddenly felt dizzy and complained of feeling faint. Mrs. Walsh, who had been preparing to leave for another patient in a distant homestead, immediately returned to Margery's bedside to assess her condition. Within minutes, Margery had lost consciousness completely, her body going limp despite Mrs. Walsh's efforts to revive her. The midwife worked frantically to restore Margery's breathing and circulation, using techniques that had saved other women who had experienced similar post-birth complications. But while Mrs. Walsh was focused on saving Margery's life, Annabelle began showing signs of distress that escalated rapidly into crisis. The baby's breathing became shallow and irregular. Her skin took on a bluish tint that indicated insufficient oxygen, and her tiny body grew cold despite being wrapped in warm blankets. Mrs. Walsh found herself facing every midwife's worst nightmare: two patients in mortal danger simultaneously, with no help available and no way to save both of them with her limited resources. She made the agonizing decision to focus her efforts on Margery, reasoning that saving the mother might still allow the possibility of saving the child, while losing both would be an absolute tragedy. After nearly an hour of urgent care, Margery slowly regained consciousness. Her first instinct was to look for her daughter, but when her eyes fell on the still form beside her, she realized the truth. Annabelle had passed away, while Mrs. Walsh was fighting to keep Margery alive. The baby's tiny face was serene, yet cold and lifeless. Her time in the world her parents had so eagerly prepared for, lasting less than 3 hours. A wave of grief that swept over Margery was unlike anything she had ever known, even after the tragedies she had already endured. Clutching Annabelle's body to her chest, she wept with a sound so raw and wrenching that Mrs. Walsh would later say it was the most sorrowful thing she had ever heard. Robert, who had been waiting in the kitchen through the ordeal, entered the room to find both his wife and child taken by forces beyond his understanding or power to fight. "She was perfect," Margery whispered through her tears. "She was breathing, looking at me. Everything was fine. How could she be gone so quickly? Why would God give her to me, only to take her away again?" Mrs. Walsh had no answer. In all her years tending to births on the frontier, she had never seen a baby so apparently healthy slip away so suddenly. There had been no signs of breathing trouble, heart defects, or any of the conditions that so often claimed newborn lives. The next day, the people of Millerville gathered at the Falls farm for a quiet funeral. Reverend William Thompson, who ministered to several scattered settlements, led a graveside service in the small cemetery on a hill above the prairie. Though still frail from childbirth and the shock of loss, Margery refused to remain in bed. Against Mrs. Walsh's cautions, she attended, sitting beside the tiny grave while the Reverend spoke of God's mysterious purposes and the promise of resurrection, a hope that, for the faithful, could shine even in the darkest moments. "We do not understand why some children are taken from us so quickly," Reverend Thompson said, as the spring wind carried his words across the gathered mourners. "But we trust that Annabelle Falls is now in the arms of her Heavenly Father, free from the pain and suffering of this world. Her life, though brief, was a gift that brought joy to her parents and reminded us all of the precious nature of the time we have with those we love." The funeral concluded with the singing of hymns that had comforted countless families through similar losses, and the community dispersed with the understanding that the Falls family would need time and privacy to grieve. Mrs. Walsh remained with Margery for several more days, monitoring her physical recovery and providing emotional support during the worst period of her bereavement. But Margery's grieving took a form that worried everyone who observed it. Instead of the gradual acceptance that typically followed infant death, she seemed to become more obsessed with Annabelle's loss as the days passed. She would spend hours sitting in the rocking chair where she had planned to nurse her daughter, holding the blankets that still carried the baby's scent and talking to Annabelle as if she were still present. Robert tried to comfort his wife by encouraging her to focus on the future and the possibility that they might have other children who would live to adulthood. But Margery seemed unable to move beyond the few hours she had shared with Annabelle. reliving every moment and blaming herself for somehow failing to protect her daughter. "I should have known something was wrong," Margery would say repeatedly. "I should have felt it when she started getting sick. A mother is supposed to know when her child is in danger. I failed her when she needed me most." Mrs. Walsh reassured Margery that there was nothing she could have done to prevent Annabelle's death, explaining that sometimes babies died for reasons that medical science could not understand or predict. But Margery's guilt and grief seemed to intensify rather than diminish as the days passed following the funeral. The crisis that would change everything began on April 25th, 10 days after Annabelle's birth and death. Margery had been growing increasingly withdrawn and agitated, eating little and sleeping poorly, when she suddenly began experiencing symptoms that resembled a severe illness. She developed a high fever, complained of severe headaches, and began speaking incoherently about seeing Annabelle in the room with her. Mrs. Walsh, who had been checking on Margery daily since the funeral, was summoned by Robert when his wife's condition deteriorated rapidly. The midwife found Margery burning with fever and muttering about Annabelle returning to her, about needing to prepare for the baby's arrival. "She's coming back," Margery said during brief moments of lucidity. "I can feel her moving inside me again. She's not gone. She was just waiting for the right time to come home. Dr. Bark is at the moment when the carbolic rebellion invades her. She can feel her moving inside me again. She's not gone. She was just waiting for the right time to come home." Dr. Bark became pregnant. Breaking news. What does that mean exactly? She's coming back. Dog, she's coming back. Dr. Bark became pregnant. Dr. Bark became pregnant. Dr. Bark became pregnant. Morrison was summoned from his rounds in a distant settlement, but it would take him 2 days to reach the Falls farmstead. In the meantime, Mrs. Walsh did everything she could to reduce Margery's fever and keep her comfortable, but the woman's condition continued to worsen throughout the night. By dawn on April 26th, Margery had fallen into a deep coma that left her unresponsive to voice, touch, or other stimuli. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Her pulse was weak but regular, and her fever had reached dangerous levels that Mrs. Walsh feared might cause permanent damage or death. Robert sat beside his wife's bed throughout the day, holding her hand and speaking to her, even though she showed no signs of awareness. He prayed for her recovery and struggled to understand how he could lose both his daughter and his wife within such a short period of time. Mrs. Walsh remained at the farmstead, monitoring Margery's condition and preparing for the possibility that she might not survive the crisis. The midwife had seen similar cases of fever and delirium following childbirth and infant death, but Margery's symptoms seemed more severe than anything she had encountered previously. As night fell on April 26, Margery's condition began to change in ways that puzzled everyone present. Her fever broke suddenly, her breathing became deeper and more regular, and she began moving restlessly as if experiencing vivid dreams. But most strangely, her abdomen began to show signs of distension that resembled early pregnancy. Mrs. Walsh examined Margery carefully and found that her body was displaying symptoms consistent with being several months pregnant. Despite having given birth just 11 days earlier, the changes were dramatic and medically impossible, but they were unmistakably real to everyone who observed them. "I don't understand what's happening," Mrs. Walsh confided to Robert as they watched Margery's condition continue to evolve throughout the night. "Her body is acting like she's pregnant again, but that's not possible so soon after giving birth. And even if it were possible, the timing doesn't make sense." By morning on April 27th, Margery's abdomen had swelled to a size consistent with being 8 or 9 months pregnant, and she was experiencing what appeared to be labor contractions. Her fever had completely disappeared, but she remained unconscious even as her body prepared for what seemed to be another birth. Mrs. Walsh found herself in the unprecedented situation of attending a woman who appeared to be giving birth to a child she could not possibly be carrying. The contractions were real and strong. Margery's body was responding exactly as it would during normal labor, but the medical circumstances made no sense, according to anything the midwife had learned during her years of practice. Robert was torn between hope and terror as he watched his wife's mysterious condition unfold. Part of him wanted to believe that God was somehow giving them another chance to have the child they had lost, but another part feared that they were witnessing something unnatural that might bring more tragedy than blessing. Dr. Morrison arrived at the farmstead during the early afternoon of April 27th, having ridden hard for 2 days to reach his patient. His examination of Margery confirmed what Mrs. Walsh had observed. The woman was unmistakably in active labor, despite having given birth less than 2 weeks earlier. "I have never encountered anything like this in 30 years of medical practice," Dr. Morrison told Robert after completing his examination. "Your wife's body is behaving exactly as if she is giving birth to a full-term infant, but that is medically impossible under these circumstances. I can only conclude that we are witnessing some form of hysteria or delusion brought on by grief and fever." But even as Dr. Morrison spoke, Margery's contractions intensified, and her body began the final stages of labor. Whether the phenomenon was medical, psychological, or something else entirely, it was undeniably real and progressing toward what appeared to be the birth of a child. The second birth of Annabelle Falls occurred at 2:17 p.m. on April 27, 1869, exactly 12 days after her first birth, and at precisely the same time of day. The baby who emerged from Margery's womb appeared to be identical in every detail to the infant who had died 10 days earlier. Dr. Morrison delivered the child himself, assisted by Mrs. Walsh, while Robert waited anxiously in the kitchen as he had during the first birth. The baby was a healthy girl, weighing approximately 6 pounds, with dark hair, pale blue eyes, and skin that was pink and normal. Most remarkably, she bore an identical birthmark on her left shoulder that had characterized the first Annabelle. "It's impossible," Dr. Morrison whispered as he examined the newborn. "This child appears to be identical to the infant who died. Same size, same features, same birthmark. But that's not medically possible. Babies don't return from the dead, and women don't give birth to the same child twice." Mrs. Walsh cleaned and wrapped the baby exactly as she had done 12 days earlier, noting that the infant's cry was identical to the sound the first Annabelle had made, and that her movements and behavior seemed precisely the same. When placed in Margery's arms, the baby began nursing immediately, just as her predecessor had done. Margery awakened from her coma the moment the baby was placed against her chest, opening her eyes and smiling as if nothing unusual had occurred. She looked down at the infant with the same expression of love and wonder that had characterized her first moments with Annabelle, showing no surprise at the miraculous circumstances of this second birth. "Hello, my darling," Margery whispered to the baby. "I knew you would come back to me. I knew you weren't really gone." Robert entered the room to find his wife conscious and alert, holding a baby who appeared to be the exact same daughter they had buried 10 days earlier. His emotions overwhelmed him as he struggled to understand what he was witnessing, torn between joy at having his family restored and confusion about the impossible nature of what had occurred. Dr. Morrison examined both mother and child extensively, searching for any medical explanation for what he had witnessed. Margery showed no signs of having been critically ill just hours earlier, and the baby displayed all the characteristics of a healthy newborn. But the doctor could find no rational way to explain how a woman could give birth to the same child twice, or how a dead infant could return to life. "I must document what I have observed, but I cannot provide any medical explanation for these events," Dr. Morrison told the family. "From a scientific standpoint, what has occurred is impossible, but I cannot deny the evidence of my own senses. This child appears to be identical to the infant who died, and she is undeniably alive and healthy. Mrs. Walsh was equally puzzled by what she had witnessed, but her focus was on the practical needs of mother and child rather than the theoretical implications of their situation. Both Margery and the baby required care and monitoring to ensure their continued health, regardless of the mysterious circumstances of the birth. Over the following days, the second Annabelle displayed behaviors that convinced everyone present that she was indeed the same child who had died 10 days earlier. She responded to the same stimuli that had comforted the first baby. She showed identical feeding patterns and sleep cycles, and she seemed to recognize her parents' voices and touch. Most remarkably, the baby showed signs of retaining memories from her brief first life. She would cry when placed in the same bassinet where the first Annabelle had died, but would calm immediately when moved to different locations. She seemed to respond to lullabies that Margery had sung to the first baby, even though this new infant had never heard them before. Dr. Morrison documented these observations with growing amazement and concern. The baby's behavior suggested not just physical resemblance to the first Annabelle, but actual continuity of memory and personality that challenged fundamental assumptions about death, consciousness, and individual identity. The infant displays recognition of people, places, and stimuli that she could not have encountered in her current existence, Dr. Morrison wrote in his medical notes. Her responses suggest that she retains memories from the previous infant's brief life, which is medically and scientifically impossible according to all established knowledge. Word of the miraculous birth spread quickly through the scattered settlements of the Kansas Territory, attracting visitors who came to see the child who had allegedly returned from the dead. Some viewed the event as a divine miracle that demonstrated God's power over death, while others suspected fraud or delusion on the part of the grieving family. Reverend Thompson visited the Falls farmstead to see the second Annabelle for himself, struggling to reconcile what he observed with his theological understanding of life, death, and resurrection. The baby was undeniably real and healthy, but the circumstances of her birth challenged religious doctrine about the nature of death and the afterlife. "I have never encountered anything like this in my ministry," Reverend Thompson confided to other community leaders. "The child appears to be the same infant we buried, but Christian theology teaches us that resurrection is reserved for the end times. I cannot explain what has occurred here, but I cannot deny that something extraordinary has taken place." The community's reaction to the second Annabelle was mixed, with some families embracing the event as a miracle, while others viewed it as something unnatural that might bring misfortune to the settlement. Several families began keeping their distance from the Falls farmstead, fearing that whatever force had brought the baby back might have unpredictable consequences for others. Mrs. Walsh continued to monitor both Margery and Annabelle during the weeks following the second birth, documenting the child's development and searching for any signs that might explain what had occurred. The baby grew and thrived exactly as the first Annabelle had been expected to do, showing normal development and healthy responses to her environment. But there were subtle differences that troubled those who observed the child carefully. The second Annabelle would sometimes stare at empty spaces as if seeing things that others could not perceive, and she would smile and coo as if interacting with invisible companions. These behaviors were not necessarily abnormal for infants, but they took on ominous significance given the circumstances of her birth. Dr. Morrison made regular visits to examine the second Annabelle throughout the summer of 1869, hoping to find medical explanations for her existence or signs that might predict her future development. The child remained healthy and normal in all measurable respects, but she continued to display the mysterious behaviors that suggested awareness of things beyond ordinary infant perception. the subject continues to develop normally from a physical standpoint, Dr. Morrison recorded in August 1869. However, her behavioral patterns include responses to stimuli that are not present in her environment, suggesting either unusual sensory abilities or psychological remnants from her previous existence. As autumn approached, the Falls family began to consider leaving Kansas territory to escape the attention and suspicion that surrounded their miraculous child. While some neighbors continued to view Annabelle as a blessing, others whispered about curses and unnatural forces that might endanger the entire community. The decision to leave was hastened by incidents that suggested the second Annabelle's presence was indeed affecting others in ways that could not be explained. Several families reported strange dreams about deceased children, and some claimed to see apparitions of dead infants in their homes. Whether these phenomena were related to Annabelle's return or were simply the result of community hysteria, they created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made normal life difficult. Robert began making preparations for the family's departure in September 1869, selling their land and possessions to finance a move to Colorado Territory, where they might be able to start fresh without the burden of their extraordinary reputation. The decision was painful for Margery, who had hoped to raise her daughter in the community where she had been born, but the alternative was to live under constant scrutiny and suspicion. The farewell gathering for the Falls family was attended by most of the community, including those who had been frightened by recent events. Reverend Thompson offered prayers for their safe journey and their future happiness, while acknowledging that their departure might help restore peace to a community that had been unsettled by mysteries beyond their understanding. We may never understand what occurred in the Falls household during those remarkable days in April, Reverend Thompson said during the farewell service, but we can be grateful that love proved stronger than death and that a family was reunited through means that surpass human comprehension. The Falls family departed Millerville, Kansas in October 1869, traveling by wagon toward Colorado Territory, where they hoped to build a new life free from the shadows of their past. They carried with them few possessions, but profound questions about the nature of life, death, and the mysterious forces that had restored their daughter to them. The second Annabelle grew into a healthy child who showed no obvious signs of her unusual origins. She developed normally, learned to walk and talk at appropriate ages, and displayed the typical curiosity and energy of any growing child. But she retained certain behaviors that distinguished her from other children and reminded her family of the extraordinary circumstances of her birth. Throughout her childhood, Annabelle would occasionally speak of events and people that she could not have known about through normal experience. She would mention neighbors from the Kansas settlement who had died before her birth, describe buildings and places that no longer existed, and demonstrate knowledge of family history that had never been shared with her. Most unsettling were her references to the period between her deaths, the 10 days when the first Annabelle lay buried while the second was somehow waiting to be born. She would speak casually about the quiet time when she had watched her family grieve and had tried to comfort them even though they could not see or hear her. "I wanted to tell you I wasn't really gone," Annabelle would say to her mother during quiet moments. "I could see you crying, and I wanted to hold your hand, but I couldn't touch anything until it was time to come back." These statements, delivered with the innocent matter-of-factness that characterized all of Annabelle's speech, convinced Margery that her daughter truly was the same child who had died, returned through means that transcended human understanding. While others might doubt or question, Margery knew with absolute certainty that love had proven stronger than death. The Falls family eventually settled in a small farming community near Denver, where they lived quietly and avoided discussing the unusual circumstances of Annabelle's birth. Robert found work as a carpenter and farmer. Margery focused on domestic life and child rearing, and Annabelle grew up as a normal child who happened to carry within her the memories of 2 lifetimes. Dr. Morrison continued to correspond with the family for several years, documenting Annabelle's development and searching for insights that might explain what had occurred. His letters, preserved in family papers, provide a unique record of a child's growth under extraordinary circumstances. The subject continues to display normal physical and intellectual development, Dr. Morrison wrote in 1872. However, she retains unusual memories and perceptions that suggest continuity from her previous existence. Her case challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of death and the possibility of return from beyond. By the time Annabelle reached school age, her unusual origins had become family secret rather than public knowledge. She attended school with other children, made friends, and participated in community activities without attracting attention or suspicion. But her parents remained alert for signs that her extraordinary nature might manifest in ways that could create problems or dangers. The adult Annabelle married and raised a family of her own, living a conventional life that gave no outward sign of her miraculous origins. She rarely spoke of her unusual memories or her awareness of things beyond normal perception, choosing instead to focus on the ordinary joys and challenges of domestic life. But family members noted that Annabelle possessed intuitive abilities that seemed to transcend normal human perception. She could sense when distant relatives were in trouble. She could predict weather changes and accidents with uncanny accuracy, and she showed an unusual ability to comfort people who were grieving or suffering. She always knew things, her daughter later recalled. Mother would know when someone was going to die before they got sick, when letters were coming before they arrived, when weather was going to change before any signs appeared. She said it was like remembering things that hadn't happened yet. Annabelle lived until 1943, dying peacefully at age 74, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had heard fragments of her story but never fully understood its implications. Her death was as mysterious as her births had been, occurring exactly 74 years after her first birth and 74 years and 12 days after her second. The medical records from Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Walsh were eventually deposited in historical archives, where they remain available to researchers studying unexplained phenomena and cases of apparent resurrection. These documents provide detailed contemporary accounts of events that challenge conventional understanding of life, death, and the nature of human existence. Modern researchers who have studied the Falls case note several characteristics that distinguish it from other reported instances of children who claim to remember previous lives. Annabelle's case involved actual physical death and return rather than simple memory retention, and it was documented by trained medical professionals who had no reason to fabricate or exaggerate their observations. Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist who spent decades studying cases of apparent reincarnation and past life memories, reviewed the Falls family records and concluded that they represented one of the most compelling documented cases of human resurrection ever recorded. While he could not provide scientific explanations for what occurred, he acknowledged that the evidence was too detailed and consistent to dismiss as fraud or delusion. The farmstead where Annabelle was born and died and born again has long since disappeared beneath the expansion of modern agriculture and development. But local historians maintain records of the Falls family story, and occasional visitors to the area report unusual experiences that suggest the mysterious events of 1869 may have left lasting effects on the land itself. Some visitors describe sensing the presence of children in areas where no children are present, hearing the sound of babies crying when no infants are nearby, and experiencing sudden waves of emotion that seem connected to memories that belong to someone else. Whether these phenomena are related to Annabelle's story or are simply the result of suggestion and local folklore, they serve as reminders that some mysteries about human existence may be beyond our current ability to understand. for those willing to consider the possibility that death might not be the absolute ending we have traditionally believed it to be. The story of Margery Falls and her daughter Annabelle offers compelling evidence that love may indeed be stronger than death, and that the bonds between mothers and children may transcend even the ultimate separation that death appears to create. Whether Annabelle truly returned from the dead through divine intervention, natural forces that science has yet to discover, or mechanisms that operate according to principles beyond current human understanding, her case continues to challenge our assumptions about the nature of life, death, and the mysterious connections that bind us to those we love most deeply. A mother who gave birth to the same child twice has left us with questions about existence and identity that may take generations to answer. But her story serves as a reminder that human experience may be far more complex and wonderful than we have dared to imagine, and that the deepest mysteries of life and death may be hidden in the love between parents and children that refuses to be broken even by the grave. What do you think about Margery Falls' extraordinary experience of giving birth to the same child twice? Do you believe it's possible for the dead to return to life through the power of a mother's love? Or do you think there might be other explanations for what the witnesses described? Have you ever heard of similar cases of apparent resurrection, or experienced connections with loved ones that seem to transcend death itself? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've encountered stories like this in your own family or community. If you found this mystery as compelling as I did, make sure to subscribe for more stories that challenge our understanding of life, death, and the bonds that connect us across the ultimate boundaries. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these investigations into the most extraordinary cases in American history. And remember, the most profound truths about human existence often emerge from experiences that seem too miraculous to believe, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond the limits of conventional thinking.